Welcome to session 5 of Afro-Latinx Poetry Now. Brought to you by the Institute for Latino Studies and the Initiative on Race and Resilience, along with several other campus sponsors and benefactors who are listed on the back of the program. Before I proceed, a small confession. I had a hiccup in my opening remarks to session 2 yesterday because I was about to read remarks that were no longer true. In other words, our lineup of scholars is incomplete. Yesterday, we were going to hear via Zoom Pablo Jose Lopez Oro, who is going to speak on the poetry of Darrow Alejandro Holness. And so I want to acknowledge that we are, in a sense, an incomplete group. And what I was going to do is briefly bring Francisco Robles to the podium to say a few words about Pablo. And then I was going to introduce Francisco, but what resulted was sort of a clumsy, to borrow a football term, clumsy audible. My intention was to highlight in a less clumsy fashion how crucial Francisco Robles' role has been in shaping our lineup of scholars. And today, he has graciously and generously agreed to say a few introductory remarks about 2 of our scholars, Judith Rodríguez and Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez. But before he does, let me say something about our second speaker. What I'm about to say, and take note, I say without any ambiguity. I've been at the helm of Letras Latinas since 2004. In 2024, we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary. And in that time, the Notre Dame faculty member I've had the most fruitful and collaborative relationship with is our second speaker. No other faculty member has more consistently amplified, and by that I mean teaching and bringing into her classroom the Latinx writers I've brought to Notre Dame than Marisel Moreno. The list of Letras Latinas writers, Letras Latinas writers she's taught, written about, and interviewed is considerable, and she's made my work in this regard more meaningful and a pleasure. Thank you. And now, please welcome Francisco Robles, who will say a few words about Judith and Yomaira, and we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. So Judy will be joining us virtually. So I'm going to say a couple of words about Judith. I will say with these remarks, following Francisco's lead, we have the same name, which is just an endless delight to me. I am not going to say much about scholarship per se. I am, but in a slightly different way. So I first met Judith Rodríguez through the indomitable and inimitable Michael Dowdy, who I should say was at a previous large poetry gathering that Francisco Aragon hosted here at Notre Dame, which then became the anthology Angels of the Americlips. So I met Judith through Michael. And my acquaintance with Judy remains, sadly, confined to the digital realm. But to read Judy's work and to hear her expound her scholarship is to feel her energetic aliveness as a thinker. Her work on Black Boricua punk music and visual aesthetics resonates or reroutes sound studies and post-colonial studies by demanding we hear the particularities of anti-colonialism. Her concept of ennegrecimiento, a methodological and linguistic translation of Lewis Gordon's idea of blackening, is, in her own words, an antagonistic act imposed upon the embedded cultural fantasies of blanqueamiento. It's not just resistant, it's active. That's the antagonism that she's talking about. It's making something of resistance. It's also, as she points out in a truly phenomenal essay, funking the jíbaro. It's a method of marronaje that evades civil society's racist frameworks and deliberately sets out to reshape possibility and belonging. And I can't wait for you to hear Judy's work today. The next scholar I'm going to introduce is Yomaira Figueroa. So I first met Yomaira Figueroa at a conference in Mexico, where I also met Pablo José López Oro, who sadly could not be here today. It was a conference called the Tepoztlán Institute for the Transnational History of the Americas. She's brilliant, she's kind, she's funny, and everyone who knows her knows this. She has an incisive mind that blazes through conceptual problems like Alexander the Great's mighty sword, cutting through the Gordian knot. She just cuts it in half. To know Yomaira is to know that your work will be better. And I say this because for a cluster of essays I edited with Bill Orchard, a colleague of ours, a scholar at CUNY Queens College, I found that editing Yomaira's work meant that somehow I found myself editing my own work, actually.
Recording in progress.
It's amazing to encounter a scholar whose electric work lights up your own and makes you really rethink your own work. So Yomaira is the author of several texts that tease me about how much I need to wash my dishes. This is all gonna be a little bit silly, I'm sorry. There's no way someone can be infinitely patient with someone who just spends half of his day staring at and griping about dirty dishes. But Yomaira is. Yomaira is the recipient of countless memes, mostly about dogs and dishwashing. Yomaira has gained numerous mentees because of her wit, her brilliance, her mentorship, her generosity, and it's all part of a broader, warm aura that blesses us. And I'm gonna finish by reading a poem that she wrote. It's part of a book printed at a 2019 workshop with Mayra Santos Febres up at Michigan State. Mayra and Yomaira invited students and colleagues to write poetry in this workshop, and then they printed this, a limited edition of 50 books that they made that day, and then distributed them. And so it was a wonderful gift. Some students and I actually went to Michigan State for this event, and she gifted us these books, which I think just says a lot. So this poem of Yomaira's is called Jacinta, Palmera, Yomaira, Catalina. It's all in Spanish, so actually, apologies also for how I'm gonna read this. Papi quería que su única hija tuviera el nombre de su abuela querida, sagrada, Jacinta. Mami dijo que ese nombre era para una vieja. Ella quiso llamarme Palmera para tener siempre su isla en su corazón. Me llamaron Yomaira, nombre popular sí, y nombre de una vecina muy querida y de buen corazón. Y así, y así, y así. Pero papi me puso también Catalina, el nombre de su madre que perdió de pequeño. Su hija iba a llevar un nombre de esa barriada de Vega Baja, el Alto de Cuba. So I present to you Yomaira, Judith, and Marisel again.
Hello, everybody. Hello, amazing beings. I'm so sad that I can't be with y'all in person today, but I hope you're all enjoying each other's company, hugging on each other, loving on each other. Before I get started, I just want to do a short land acknowledgement. We recognize that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Olón tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Olón people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples, especially this university's. I feel so grateful and moved to be here virtually with you all today. And it's an honor to be chosen, like especially an honor to be chosen to comment on the beautiful and powerful poetics of Jasminne Mendez. And to be among so many brilliant colleagues and mentors I've admired. And I especially want to thank Francisco Robles and Francisco Aragon for organizing this much needed event on Afro-Latinx poetics. And I also just want to thank everybody, you know, in the background who are doing all of the silent labor. And Francisco for accommodating me virtually. And I hope that, yeah, this will, provide some kind of conversation afterwards. And so I'm going to go ahead and just provide a kind of introduction to Jasminne's work right in the beginning. So Jasminne Mendez, first and foremost, is a Dominican-American poet, playwright, translator, and award-winning author of several books for children and adults. She is the author of 2 hybrid memoirs, Island of Dreams and Night Blooming Jasmine, which I will be speaking more about, personal essays and poetry. Her second young adult memoir, Islands Apart, Becoming Dominican American, came out actually this past summer, 2002. I was able to purchase it. And her debut poetry, City Without Altar, which I will be speaking on today, was a finalist for the Noemi Press Book Award for Poetry. And it is now released. It is now released. It was released on August 22nd. And she's also a translator. And so I'm going to go ahead and just jump right into it. I've been thinking about this work for the last year. And so this is very uncomfortable to not be able to be in the presence of Jasminne right now, which I was very much looking forward to, and all of the other poets. So in the beginning of the summer, Francisco sent me Jasminne Mendez's newest work, City Without Altar, a play in the form of verse, or what she calls a choreo poem. The choreo poem re-narrates and theatricalizes the poetics of the blackened border with Haiti of the Jabón in the Dominican Republic of the 1930s during the Perejil or Parsley Massacre, which was also known as El Corte or the cut. I begin this presentation on Mendez's oeuvre with her newest work because as soon as I opened the PDF, I seem to have already surrendered to the text. I found myself sitting down to read through the entire choreo poem in one sitting, after which I sent her an email. I was blown. I was captivated by the text, especially after reading Mendez's genealogy of love and pain and desire in her second collection, Night Blooming Jasmine, where she narrates herself in poetry and prose in the form of a Black Caribbean feminist disability Bildungsroman. Yet in this earlier work, the normative coming of age story is rewritten to illuminate Mendez's life world, where she breaks down her subjectivity and objectivity into 5 movable parts. And I use the word movable because of the ways in which Mendez ruptures normative temporality with her poetics, all informed by an ecological commitment to the experience of disability, the ways in which Caribbean Blackness frames disability through Mendez's own autopoetic writing. Indeed, numerous diagnoses come to a head in Night Blooming Jasmine, as her desire to have a child overruns her body's ability to carry a child to term. Suffering within this context is in direct relation to and entangled with the joy and pain of giving birth to life and loving that life. What Denise Ferreira de Silva terms Black feminist poethics, where the ethic emerges from a Blackened and femme experience of the world, is articulated through the cutting and the slicing of the body, both in the massacring context of El Corte and its haunting by way of the mark of disability in losing flesh. Inventing a trans-historical mode of writing where her own loss of flesh is narrated as with alongside of El Corte, Mendez writes. It says that I can't share now for some reason. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Lo puedo leer también. I could just go ahead and just read it if you'd like to. Oh, perfect. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay. Awake enough to feel a lot of pressure. Can everybody see this, first of all? Yes. Yes, okay. Awake enough to feel a lot of pressure, like a tooth extraction on my hand, decapitated, axed, and thrown into ditches. It was genocide. Where would the pieces of me end up? Awake enough to feel the coolness of the metal table along my spine. I tried not to shiver for fear the doctor would miss his mark. The sweat glistened on their black bodies beneath the moonlight as they dodged and ducked the blades of bigotry, swinging away at them. Awake enough, we all held our breaths and said a prayer to a God we didn't think was listening. Awake enough to know that when it was over, we would no longer be whole. We would always be broken because fingertips, like people, don't grow back. No doubt, this prose reads as a precursor to the writing in City Without Altar, illuminating the transhistorical bodily entanglement of Mendez's blackened and feminized experiences with her autoimmunities with that of El Corte. El Corte haunts and reinterprets her own experience through the structural bigotry and violence of Trujillo's anti-Haitianness and anti-Blackness. As such, when she states that Haitians along the northern border zone were, quote, decapitated, axed, and thrown into ditches, the scale of signification and effectual reach of such an event goes beyond our current understandings around the historical record. The effects are found in the roots of the land and in the nervous system of its people, a connection Mendez astutely writes into being. This haunting of El Corte within the writing or the expression of suffering brilliantly framed by Mendez's joyous and torturous desire for a child. At the level of abstract, Mendez here theorizes how, quote, female sexuality and reproduction are better understood via a framework of emergence and within the context of iterative, interactive, multiscalar systems, biological, psychological, environmental, and cultural. And that was Zakiya Iman Jackson. There's a field of thought or a kind of aesthetic terrain which Mendez begins to create through the entanglement of El Corte, disability, and reproductive love, suffering, and pain. Dominicanidad, family, love, and loss are all written into being through the lens of disability, through the lens of a Black and Dominican feminist border embodiment. And I guess in this way, I'm kind of in conversation with some of the work that somebody like John Cutler Alba would be doing with regards to thinking about the border. Mendez's newest work, City Without Altar, seemed distinctive with regards to her oeuvre, in that its poetic elements were choreographed in the form of a play. In the form of a play with full stage direction and a diagram where she asked the reader or audience to create the stage design and maybe even ask them to block the characters as well. A very thoughtful and inventive way of breaking the fourth wall, I thought. Yet her poetics enables a form of thought and writing that undoes the normative narratological work of the play script. And I would even go as far as to say that it undoes theater's genres in general, or even genre in general. Black feminist playwright and scholar J. Austin Williams writes, quote, some contemporary dramatists are consciously confronting the Black predicament, others more subconsciously. But in one way or another, many Black playwrights engage the Black suffering born of captivity, what Orlando Patterson describes in part as general dishonor in their work, end quote. Following Williams, I closely read the poetics of Mendez's choreo poem as dramatic theorization, where she, quote, interrogates rather than reifies redemption, end quote, by way of a living staged altar. in the form of city without altar. For redemption itself is found in the act of writing, the performance of the body as self-actualization in Black study. Reading Mendez's work with this in mind, then I found a kind of through line which manifests as a material entanglement of ancestral love and suffering bound to the Blackened border and thus to her body. And before I go on, I do want to just clarify how I'm using the active noun and adjective Blackened. I follow Zakiya Iman Jackson's application of the term and explaining the gendered transmogrification and imposition of abstractive violence onto Afro-descended peoples throughout the African diaspora. And this abstractive violence made Blackness human, subhuman, and non-human all at the same time within the symbolic order and civil society. In other words, quote, observation of gender and sex was deployed in the interest of producing race as a visualizable fact, end quote. And as such, the gendered transmogrification, what Jackson calls plasticization of the African, played a crucial role in the aesthetic creation of ethno-racialism within the Hispanophone Caribbean through Blackening's double violence. First, the extraction of aesthetic Blackness within Hispanophone worlds, and two, this extraction's production of jurisprudence, thereby delineating relation and proximity to whiteness. See now, Mendez would ostensibly describe this Blackening as black out, as disavowal and avowal, sense and nonsense, unworlding and otherworlding. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn to the text so we can all read it together. Blackout, a transient dulling or loss of vision, consciousness, or memory. Example, some victims of the massacre will black out after they are cut, as in suppression of information, especially one imposed on the media by the government. Example, Trujillo issued a blackout on information released about the massacre, as in a poem created by blacking out the text of another document. Example, I and the border have seen Haitians living in peace. This will continue. Dated October 2nd, 1937. As in a moment in theater when stage lights are turned off to separate scenes in a play. Example, there will be many blackouts in this play. Yes, okay. Blackout is both an effect of blackening and a poetic interruption. The blacking out of victims during El Corte, the affected dimensions of which emerge from experiencing otherworldly pain, is dually blacked out of history. This historical disavowal upholds the blacking out in a Dominican birth certificate. Let me go back to the Yaki. And here we have Mendez's birth certificate. She writes, inheritance, what will they make us forget? On this day in history, I am born, alive. Let the record show I am Hispanic, not Black. This is legal, a record, permanent. All items listed are accurate and complete. On this day in history, I am blacked out, she writes. While other blackouts, so this historical disavowal upholds the blacking out in a Dominican birth certificate, while other blackouts separate scenes and separate countries. Blackout here reads intramurally within the invention of Dominicanness through the process of blacking out time and space, blacking out history. And yet, Mendez provides the reader audience one unruly visual of blackout that yields its own time and as well as its own space. And let me just go back to the text where she actually blacks it out. I and the border have seen Haitians living in peace. This will continue. And she dates this text, again, October 2nd, 1937. The speaker here finds intimacy with the border through blackening what could be an excerpt from Trujillo's anti-Haitian, anti-Black inflammatory speech, which initiated el golpe. The roughness of visuality in this declarative statement takes precedent over desiring some sense of poetic redemption. And this roughness, this blackening, affectively registers as ancestral love. And so I read Mendez's use of the conjunctive as framing the relation of violence and repair through sense, in the sense of blackouts. The as in, the conjunctive, gestures to a poetics of decipherment to riff off Sylvia Wynter. There seems to be a kind of talking back, or what Bell Hooks terms an oppositional gaze, that the conjunctive gestures to. I mean, there seems to be an entire field of knowledge, to be honest with you, through the as in itself, through the conjunctive. Like, I feel like there's another book. It's brilliant. Mendez ostensibly writes into being another narratological mode where the poetic of the as in collectively and ancestrally relays the sense of the ethno-nationalist engendered anti-Black event of the Parsley Massacre, and thus shows the violence of fact, of objectivity. Mendez deracinates medico-scientific discourse from its anti-Black foundations by inventing her own poetic devices that don't care about it, that formulate a kind of fugitive science, as Britt Rusert phrases. The ecological deracination of the herb perejil by Trujillo, where the verbing of the rolling R, a violent move, gestures to the terrible beauty found in the interlude or the moment after the blackout of the choreo poem. And I'm just going to go back. And after the blackout, you will find this moment within the second, I believe this is the third piece, the third section. In this way, the choreo poem could be read through what Dixa Ramirez Diolio phrases as a barbed ecology because of its intramural and ecological sedimentation within Mendez's geographics of the blackened border. And these are her actual geographics. Number 21, the border. And this is the actual graphic of what the border would look like. And the jabón is found at the top. Could be read through what Dixa Ramirez Diolio phrases as a barbed ecology because of its intramural and ecological sedimentation within Mendez's geographics of the blackened border. A geographics which holds time captive within her embodiment and through which her writing abstracts the blackened border itself. It gets written into being, actually, through her own kind of inventive, poetic entanglement, right? It's just beautiful. Okay, sorry, I'm going off. I need to stay on script. Okay. Following Ramirez Diolio, barbed ecology, quote, limits the term fugitivity to denote Black people's movements frequently abetted by the natural world and darkness that attempts to disrupt colonial and capitalist scripts and spacetimes, end quote. And that was Dixa Ramirez Diolio. Mendez's City Without Altar does this work. And so the text of City Without Altar is performative, requiring the reader audience to gaze inward. And this is a really important part of the text because she begins the text asking us, what is it that we inherit and how is it that we carry what we inherit? Asking how, which means she's centering the methods in which the reader or the audience is carrying their inheritance. Requiring the reader audience to gaze inward, much like what Tina Camp phrases a Black gaze, where the racialized singular plurality of the art itself provokes a self-reflective analysis or reading of the reader audience for the reader audience. This is the emotive labor that an Afro-Latinx artist like Mendez imposes on the reader audience. Campt is fascinated with the aesthetics produced by Black contemporary artists and how their art force a recognition or encounter with the racial self. In this way, Campt no doubt gesture to Mendez's City Without Altar as provoking the reader to behold the play of poetics as a living altar, a processual ritual, an embodied recollection of spaces. Mendez generously, yet full of fervor, offers the reader audience what Fanon phrases as inventions of existence in a play and verse form, which allow her to manipulate and structure, quote, a Black gaze that mandates our participation in and interaction with the social and political questions this work raises in ways that leave us vulnerable to their effects and better off for it, end quote. And so, as a white and whitened disabled Caribbean reader, I enter Mendez's work by way of my own whitened ancestral undoing. That is through self-reflective critique in relation to Black diasporic contemporary poetics, specifically the Afro-Dominican feminist disability poetics of time and space offered to us by Mendez. Thank you so much, everyone, for allowing me to be here virtually with you. Let me unshare. Uy, bendito. There you go.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's been a wonderful 2 days, like a dream come true for for someone like me. And thank you, Francisco, for your introduction and for making these days possible. I also want to thank ILS and the Initiative on Race and Resilience, all the poets who are here. This is like poetry overload for me. I'm in heaven. My students know I teach your work all the time, so it's really amazing to be in your company. And thank you to the scholars who have joined us too. It's been really wonderful. So I'm doing this old school. I'm just gonna read my paper just to stay on track, and I don't have any fancy presentation today. So I just want to say that this is a work in progress. The first stages of it, the product of it would be the introduction to Roberto Carlos Garcia collected poems, which you can buy tonight. But this is like an extended version of what I started there. So yes, I'd be interested in hearing your comments. So the title of my paper is Pero Yo Soy Negro, Reclaiming Blackness in Roberto Carlos Garcia's Afro-Dominican Poetry. Part 1. Whether you like it or not, I'm from the Dominican Republic. I speak Spanish, pero yo soy negro. I'm Black. With this affirmation, Afro-Dominican poet Roberto Carlos Garcia centered his Blackness during an interview with me, reflecting one of the central themes of his poetry. Garcia's relatively recent entrance into the literary scene is noteworthy. His first poetry collection, Melancolia, was published in 2016, followed by Black Maybe, an Afro lyric from 2018, Elegies from 2020, and recently, or about to come out officially in December 2022, What Can I Tell You? The Selected Poems of Roberto Carlos Garcia. Garcia's poetry is broad in scope, but a constant thread that runs through it is the topic of Blackness and how it intersects with his Dominican and Latinx identities. As such, he joins the ranks of new and established Afro-Latinx poets, many of you here today, who are challenging, destabilizing, complicating, and redefining what we understand by Latinx poetry. Based on selected poems, in this presentation, I examine how the speaker embodies what critic Lorgia Garcia Peña refers to as Rayano consciousness, though I pushed its original meaning grounded on the concept of Dominicanidad to also include the marginal and precarious position that Afro-Latinx people occupy vis-a-vis U.S. Blackness. I seek to demonstrate how the speaker finds himself having to defend his Blackness in relation both to Dominicans or Latinx people and U.S. Black society. In other words, affirming his Blackness simultaneously becomes an inward and outward directed gesture that foregrounds hemispheric Blackness. So inward towards his family and Dominican society, outward in relation to U.S. society. This affirmation, in the end, mirrors what Garcia Peña refers to as the experiences of non-hegemonic Black subjects living between belonging and unbelonging in her new book, Translating Blackness. Therefore, affirming Blackness is about claiming belonging. In their introduction to the groundbreaking anthology, The Afro-Latino Reader of 2009, Miriam Jimenez, Roman, and Juan Flores define Afro-Latinos as people of African descent in Mexico, Central and South America, and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and by extension, those of African descent in the United States whose origins are in Latin America and the Caribbean. Tania Cateri Hernandez, for her part, states that the terms Afro-Latina and Afro-Latino refers to those Latinos in the United States who are of African ancestry and choose Blackness as a racial identity in addition to identifying along ethnic lines with their Latino origins. Despite the significant presence of Latinos of African descent, Hernandez affirms, and I quote, Latino studies as a discipline has traditionally reflected the invisibility of Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina identity as a result of the racialized treatment of Afro-Latino identity as foreign. In light of this, Paul Joseph Lopez Oro reminds us that the insurgence of Afro-Latinx studies is an intellectual and political response to the erasure and negation of Latinos of African descent in the field of Latinx studies. This is why events that center Black Latinx identities, such as this one, and the and also like the LSA Centering Blackness Challenging Latinidad Conference this past July, are crucial in dismantling the structures that continue to erase, silence, and invisibilize Afro-Latinos. They open up a space for dialogue. One of these structures is the concept of Latinidad. When poet Alan Peláez López first coined the hashtag Latinidad is canceled in 2018, they forced us to confront the many exclusions that hide behind this label. In an interview with Tatiana Flores, Peláez remarked, I quote, Latinidad as a form of unity is weaponized to let things slide. And by things, I am particularly referring to homophobia, transphobia, anti-Blackness, and indigenous erasure, end of quote. For the purposes of my analysis, I will focus on Latinidad as an anti-Black construct, to borrow the phrase from Flores. Undergirding Latinidad is the meta-narrative of mestizaje, or the fabulation of racial mixture of European, indigenous, and African roots. Many believe it is a democratic concept, despite the warning of scholars such as Silvio Torres Sayan and many, many others, who have decried how Latinx scholars haven't interrogated the concept of Latinidad enough. And this is what I see we are doing during these 2 days, interrogating that concept. What we know is that in reality, mestizaje is predicated on white supremacy, on the belief that societies must strive to mejorar la raza, better the race, through blanqueamiento, whitening. These ideas, including anti-Blackness, are part of the legacy of colonialism across all Latin American and Caribbean societies. Part 2. Well, a broad focus on Afro-Latinidad allows us to approach the subject from the lens of hemispheric Blackness. It is also important to pay attention to the nuances that emerge across national and regional lines in regards to Blackness and anti-Blackness. As reflected in his poems, Roberto Garcia's positionality as an Afro-Dominican in the US forces him to confront the racism of his family and Dominican community, as well as that of US society. To think through this experience of double marginalization, I find Garcia Peña's concept of Rayano consciousness to be useful. As she puts it, transcending the political and conceptual limits of the Haitian-Dominican border, Rayano consciousness, as I define it, encompasses the multiplicity of borders, transnational, interethnic, and multilinguistic that characterize the Dominican experience on and beyond the island. Rayano consciousness thus refers to the historical and present awareness of Dominican borders, symbolic, political, and geographical, a process that includes marginalized subjectivities in the imagining and narrations of Dominicanidad. As an Afro-Dominican in the diaspora, the speaker in Garcia's poems embodies Rayano consciousness as he is aware of how different borders, linguistic, geographical, and especially racial, complicate his relationship to Dominicanidad. In many of his poems, Blackness takes center stage. This is evident in Mama Anna's Flat Nose, a poem in which a child speaker questioned Mama Anna's physical traits. And I'm going to read a little bit from it. Mama, if we are part Spanish gypsy, part Taino Indian, why is your nose flat like Celia Cruz? Why is your hair deep waves like Caribbean Sea? Skin never before seen cinnamon. Why do I look like Black Chinaman? What could pass as an innocent question is in reality a loaded indictment of anti-Blackness. The child challenges Mama's claim that Dominicans are only descendants of the Spanish and Taino by comparing her nose to that of Black Cuban musician and icon Celia Cruz, and pointing out the texture of her hair and the color of her skin as well as his own. Mama's posture reflects that of Dominican Republic's official discourse of mestizaje, which according to Garcia Peña, I quote, has led to the continuous physical and epistemic violence against Dominican Blacks, Rayanos, and Haitian Dominicans, end of quote. The Dominican brand of mestizaje tends to privilege Spanish, European, and indigenous roots while erasing or minimizing the African heritage. Contradicting the standard paradigm, the speaker continues, and I quote again from the poem. Mama Pastora was Castilian gypsy, hair yellow like piss from a rum hangover, eyes blue like gunpowder flashing, white skin like bones in the grave. Papa Africa, Jose Maria, had hair tight as hide stretched over a drum, lips full like the bellies of slave ships, skin black like bones in the grave. As these verses illustrate, the speaker centers both his Spanish and African roots. Mama Pastora, of white skin, symbolizes his Spanish ancestry, which he complicates by calling attention to her gypsy identity. The references to gunpowder and rum foreground the violence of the Spanish conquest, the former alluding to its military power and the latter to the extractive sugar-based economy that developed in the Caribbean, dependent on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Papa Africa, with his lips full, like the bellies of slave ships, represents the violence of the transatlantic slave trade, which was at the root of racial capitalism. The speaker continues saying, my flat nose comes from deep inside them, our skin, nose, and hair, an antenna to both ancestors beyond the grave. By claiming his Spanish and African ancestry, in opposition to that official discourse that exalts the Spanish and indigenous roots of Dominican identity, the speaker claims Blackness as belonging to Dominicanidad. The last verse of the poem, however, is uttered by Mama Ana, who answers him by saying, "We're not black, we're tan. Now cállate." Her denial of Blackness and the use of the euphemism tan, which we can think of Indio, no, in the Dominican context, mirrors that of the state. Her violent "now cállate" aims to silence the inquisitive child by establishing her discursive authority over him. While she may think she has the last word, the reader knows that the speaker, his Rayano consciousness, knows that Blackness is central to his identity as a Dominican, and as such, he is also claiming belonging within Latinidad more broadly. So in addition to confronting erasure from Latinidad, and even their ethno-national communities, Afro-Latinx people also face marginalization from what Garcia Peña calls hegemonic Blackness. Blackness defined through US culture, politics, histories, and the Anglophone experience. This struggle emerges in several poems. For example, the poem Back to School, the B-side, opens with the line, "You ain't black, you Spanish," uttered by one of the speaker's schoolmates who is Black American. To this, the speaker replies, "I guess you English," applying the same logic that his schoolmate is using to erase the speaker's Blackness. The last stanza captures the essence of the argument. "My grandpappy's masa was from Spain. Your grandpappy's masa was from England. So who's Spanish, who English?" The speaker's words resist the idea of an homogeneous or US-centered Blackness by recalling the history of slavery that ties the descendants of enslaved Africans across hemispheres. More importantly, however, the poem challenges hegemonic Blackness by bringing visibility to Afro-descendant peoples with roots in Latin America and the Caribbean. The poem, "The Day a Poet I Looked Up To Clowned Me," also challenges hegemonic Blackness. The speaker recalls the moment a Black American poet ignored him while he introduced himself, choosing instead to socialize with a group of US Black students. He recalls, "I stared at my outstretched hand, darker than a paper bag and lighter than mulch. Oh, you're not black black?" And I'm cast off aboard my great-great-great-grandpappy's Middle Passage, his slaver to the blue-skied, salt sea air of Caribbean cane fields, same all-inclusive package as our cousins in Virginia. Here, the speaker's lighter skin color and his name, the latter a marker of his Afro-Latinx identity, exclude him from US-centered or hegemonic Blackness. He's not seen as black. In a similar move to the poem Back to School, the B-side, the poetic voice challenges that exclusion by recalling the history of slavery that unites all Afro-descendants in the Americas. The memory of his own ancestors' Middle Passage serves as a reminder of the different trajectories of slavery. The fact that the poet's ancestors were brought to what is now the US, while the speaker's ancestors were taken to the Dominican Republic, does not negate that both ancestors were enslaved. While the speaker laments the, and I quote, "move the poet performed to negate him," I see the poem as performing an important function, claiming a space for Afro-Latinos within global Blackness. The affirmation of hemispheric Blackness or global Blackness also takes place through Garcia's constant dialogue with Black and Afro-Latinx poets, authors, and intellectuals, such as James Baldwin, Aimé Césaire, Amiri Baraka, Willie Perdomo, and Miguel Piñero, among others. These intertextual references, through citations and dedications, function to ground his works within a robust transhemispheric Black genealogy. In his latest collection, Elegies, The affirmation of hemispheric blackness is grounded in the shared experience of anti-black violence. The poem Elegy for All of It reflects on the impact of symbolic and physical anti-black violence. The verses, and I quote, "The Monday after Tamir Rice's murder, many white people I knew went on with their lives," end of quote, decried the disconnect between those whose lives are protected by white privilege and those who, like the Afro-Latinx speaker, don't have a choice but to live in fear of violence due to the color of their skin. The last section of the poem lists the name of about 50, mostly black, murder victims, especially at the hands of the police. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, I'm quoting, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, Stephen Clark, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. The poem ends with the verse, "Every year, every decade, there is a list. Remember that." Demanding that as readers, we see not just the humanity of all Black people, but that we recognize the systemic racism that perpetuates the violence in order to stop it. The poem centers transhemispheric Black solidarity, and in doing so, affirms Black Latinidad as constructive of global Blackness. To conclude, in this brief analysis of selected poems by Roberto Carlos Garcia, I show how the speaker is forced to defend his Blackness, first in relation to his Dominican and Latinx community, and second in relation to the Black U.S. society. Affirming his Blackness simultaneously becomes an inward and outward gesture that foregrounds hemispheric Blackness, and by centering transhemispheric Black solidarity, his poem also affirms Black Latinidad as constitutive of global Blackness. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez. If that was a draft, then this is an outline. Thanks for nothing. All right. I think let me just let me refresh. Bet. No, ustedes no lo ven. They don't see it. I'll bet. You and me to the end of time. There we go. Okay, good. So I want to say thank you all so much. I want to thank all of the organizers, Francisco. I want to thank Francisco and Marisel, all the faculty who have welcomed us here, all of the administrators that made this possible, all of the workers who have been so genuinely kind and welcoming. It's a gift to be in your presence and to be able to share space with writers, poets, with my fellow researchers and scholars. I'm going to be reflecting today on the work of Raina J. León, who's sitting right here in the front. Shout out. Thank you. Yeah. And I specifically today am going to thread together some thoughts on two of her collections. Ay, se me quedaron por allá, espérate. Just the two books. Profeta Without Refuge and the very new, like hot off the presses, Black God, Mother This Body. So 2016 and 2022. My remarks today are going to fall across three nodes, code, genre, and body. I'm going to explain a little bit. And I also want to say, I made a joke about this being an outline, but it really is. I've been, I'll talk a little bit about it, but I'm a new mother. I have a newborn in the back. You probably heard him yammering a little bit here and there. And so I'm weak, I'm tired, okay? So you just bear with me as I go through this. So like I said, three nodes, code, genre, body. And while León's work offers many points of entry and possibilities of interpretation and theorization, I stay with these words, code, genre, and body, for 3 reasons. My work as a decolonial theorist, my current work on intimate archives, and my subject position as a new mother, a well-worn godmother, and a political body. These 3 words mark for me some of the most resonant aspects of León's work, and that is hailing ancient and contemporary codes. By this I mean mythos and digital. Crossing generic boundaries. By this I mean written, oral, and visual genres. And calling attention to nuestros muertos, gestation, and maternal bodies. While studying León's work, I could not help but to be reminded of Audre Lorde's meditation, poetry is not a luxury. León's work provides itself to be necessary, a balm, a rage, a reflection on human being. I enter here on a reflection of the human. In Profeta Without Refuge, León acts as a witness, balancing the voice of a Greek myth come African, the speaker, various characters. We peer into worlds known and unknown. Some of these guides or voices are divine and others are human. Part of the code is embedded in the book as a QR code. I'll move here so we can see a little bit here. So code. As QR codes, which can be scanned, creating a palimpsestic reading, one that overlays written with digital. The other part of the code is the inscription of memory, traumas, anxieties, and then perhaps the gift of foresight, and definitely joy, syncretism, prayer, and force in the face of an anti-Black world. And so here, code, I will read from the book. I took a photo of it from my book. And you can see here the embedded QR codes. And what I noted here is where each of the codes will take you, right? To various sites on the internet. Publishers Weekly, Mother Jones, YouTube, The Guardian UK, Without Sanctuary, Tumblr, The Daily Dot, right? And so you get to see a series, and I don't want to ruin it for you where it's going, but you get to see a series of interconnected stories of a particular moment in time around questions of race and violence, both in the streets and also the kinds of violence within our own writerly communities, right? So code. I cannot think for all the code that shows me I am dead, or not human, or soon dead, or not worthy, or that my children will know the torture written in their cells, and that our roots are steeped in blood, and there is no canopy of freedom, and that no refuge exists, and that the medium is this message of split and torn and sand, and what it would be to know in this in eons I cannot handle, this from second to second caught up in actions, tears and videos of my goddaughter tap dancing, and then questioning that breaks my heart because what should be innocent could lead to dead because she is beautiful and brown, and she is already saying at 3 that she likes white. She likes the white one better, wants ponytails and does not like her hair or the fox when it comes to Zootopia and the bunny stereotype of the little white woman who is prey but daring is right, and she wants to be the bunny, not a fox, who is a predator and expected to tear apart the prey white woman, but the police will always save us and are not to be feared, though there are names and names and names. I cannot say all of them in one breath. It would take many. And so I escape into vampires. No, they are Black immortals because we are spirit people and have always known crossroads and intersections. And before Muslim Granada and its fall, we were the holders of knowledge and travelers and thinkers, but that was last when the world was whole and honoring difference. But maybe it could be different. So I want to think on those who might have seen it and known such stability and connectedness and mourned the loss and known gods in themselves and gods by names in many languages and salt and earth and water and what would it be to be connected to the land. Not the smoke or the railroad or the machine, but the land, water, sky, and to have it respond to your own body and the spirits within and connected to the body and to see beyond the limits of the body and to resist against the binary and to be ecstatic despite the mourning and to dream a child who sees it all and grows up with it all but comes to her own divinity and to hope that my goddaughter can see her own divinity and humanity and worthiness. There's so much code and grito. Amazing. The codes are the QR codes. They take us to digital sites, some of them live and some of them deadened. The digital code is not a promise to be permanent, but the poet's code is. Right? These codes might be dead, will go, and a few of them are not there. But she's documented them for us as a witness, right? The other part of the code is the inscription of memory, traumas, anxieties, and then perhaps the gift, right, of this foresight. The code is the honoring of difference. The code is the connection to lands. The code is divinity and humanity. And there's a litany of names that are not named here, but are named through the code, right? So you'd have to go beyond, right? It's not just a simple say her name, say their name. You as the reader would have to do the work to get to that place, right? She's demanding that you work too to be a witness. Readers, we can recall the turbulent years that ushered in the Black Lives Matter movement as we know it now. We can recite a litany of names of those unjustly murdered through state-sanctioned and extralegal violence. We know also that we do not know all the names of those lost and that we continue to lose each day through malice or neglect or greed, often a lethal combination of all three. Black lives across the globe are rendered visible here on the page and are brought to us into our homes and into our mouths via her poetry. In her most recent collection, the poem Atrial Septal Defect, or We Must Leave This Country Before My Son Turns 12, the speaker laments, "Sometimes I feel the casket shroud will emerge from my own shadow to greet me smiling with my son's teeth. This country is such a cruel winter to Black boys singing their spirits from dread. It hangs their songs to clink on snow-covered boughs." There we see the impending death wish of our nation state is ever present. And right now I can't help to think about the compounded impact of Hurricane Fiona in Puerto Rico and in the wake of the devastation of Hurricane Maria, which was never properly addressed, right? Those who are dying for lack of electricity, of medication, of medical care, of water, right? Folks who are dying simply because they can't refrigerate their insulin. When we hold this alongside the kinds of police and vigilante violence that León excoriates in Profeta Without Refuge, we see more clearly how inextricably linked the lives of Black Latinx, and by this I mean Caribbean continental diasporic, and Black Americans, and by this I mean US Afro-descendants, are within the capitalist colonial matrix. León reminds us that these are codes, right? And that these are codes that are downloaded into us, but that there is a ceremony, a possibility to rewrite the code. And here we enter Sylvia Wynter. In her 1984 essay, The Ceremony Must Be Found After Humanism, writer Sylvia Wynter traces what she calls the founding heresy of the original Studia Humanitatis, meaning the radical shift between the theological man, or what she calls man one, ordered by God, the divine, mythos, theologos, and natural man, man two, led by his own reason, human epistemologies, and who creates and inscribed his own codes, culture. This code created a man that overrepresented himself as the human, right? This is the kind of general gist of this work that Wynter is telling us, right? There's a particular man who's represented himself as the human, as the only human, and all other quote unquote men are not human, right? There's the white bourgeoisie, Christian, blah, 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 right? Man. And he's done this, right, through science, philosophies, and the Studia Humanitatis. This heresy, right, the turn away from God towards the reason of man, was a whole new way of being, a self-replicating system, right, an autopoiesis. Furthermore, this colonial/Enlightenment binary of the self-other divide, right, the binary codes that we see, the kind of I am Black because you are white, I am a woman because you are a man, right, these very simplistic binaries, are established via the self-inscribed codes. And they can remind us of Descartes' declaration, I think, therefore I am, right? Giving us a really basic binary, right, of the mind-body split. In some, it's a separation of the mind and the body. And here I consider, again, Audre Lorde's counter to Descartes, I feel, therefore I can be free, right? So the body is central to this. The mind is not separate from the body, right? While the essay, The Ceremony Was Found After Humanism, is a banger. It's really good, and we can get into it. It's 53 pages, single space. You know, she's writes for a long time. And so I can't summarize the full argument here, but I can, if you take me out for a drink or something. I want to point to Winter's understanding of the heresy of the code, because the heresy is not just that original heresy, it's not just the shift from the divine dogma to secular dogma, but rather the radical decolonial potential to engage in another form of heresy, the creation of a science of the human systems that adopts, quote, a synthetic rather than a categorized approach to the human. And I hereby consider León's poetry as part of this new heresy, right? Winter argues that the studio must be reinvented as a higher order of human knowledge, be able to provide an outer view which takes the human rather than any one of its variants as a subject. It must be reformulated as a science of the human systems, right? Not just one genre of a man, but a science of the human systems with a human being, right? A series of different kinds of living beings. Bet. Okay. Genre. León's prowess as a poet is evident in how she swiftly moves across form. I want to focus on genre, that is to say politics, to memory, and to the visual, rather than, for example, to form, right? As like in that way, I'm kind of like a bad English professor. So rather than focus on is it a sonnet, is it a ghazal, is it a couplet, is it a lyric, right? I'm actually interested in the poetics about human being. And the way that she has instructed us through the work to understand that poetry must work across genres, languages, belief systems, right? As seen in Code, León layers the political, the personal, the intimate, and the ajeno. I want to shift here to discuss the images that she offers us in this new collection. It's beautiful. I mean, full color. Do you know what it takes to get full color in a book, though? Full color images. Collages. Each one is a visual manifestation of the imagery found in the poems. And so you can constantly keep going back and you see the resonances of what you read before in these pieces. And here, León's work plucks at the official archive. And here, when I think about plucking, I imagine León or the speaker or the creator of this collage furiously defeathering a bird, right? Just plucking, right? What would it mean to tear away, to get to the core truths, to reckon with the insufficiency of the written record, to reflect human being? León layers what remains of the written record and what exists with snippets of intimate archives, of photos of naming and handwriting and musings and etches. It writes back to the archive, responding to dead documents with living memory. What would it mean for us to respond to dead documents with our living memories, right? The genre, I think maybe mixed media poetics. Más o menos, that's what I'm thinking. So this is a really dope one. Start si puedes or leave if you can. And in this document, what we see is a series of data: names, dates, occupations, marital status, 2 sets of semi-blurred knowing eyes, a flock of birds in flight. Each word is a trove of information. So, I could go in here and look at the word doméstica. I actually know someone who's going through the Puerto Rican census right now, the Fernando Pico papers, looking for the term doméstica to try to trace this line of work for Black Puerto Rican women. Boom, that's it. This is, right? Puerta de tierra, soltera. Who's soltera? Who's soltero? What kind of marriage was it? Religioso. They lived at 331. They lived at 334. They're from Aguas Buenas, from Trujillo Alto, from Calle. They worked as an industrial. Sal si puedes is this amazing name, right? Leave if you can. Leave if you can. But by the way, you can never escape. Because sal si puedes, and here you are, right? And so if this family, sal si puedes, if this is indeed the ancestor of the creator of the collage, your ancestors, here you are back at sal si puedes, right? And here at the bottom, it reminds me of some of the kind of earlier reflections in the book. What conclusions can I make about this particular diasporican identity, shaped as it is by American generational legacies of struggle and resistance, the centering and multidimensionality of our Black lives, despite white supremacy and the impact of migration, words, and the legacies of racism and colorism and genocide and revolutionary struggle from my father's people, Titi's people? What does it mean to be Black, Afro-Boricua, diasporican woman, mother, me? Sal si puedes, or leave if you can. Here I think of a palimpsest as a genre, one that you're offering us here. This collage takes us to 1897, 1962, and perhaps into the 2020s. I don't really know where those photos in the corner are taken, but I'm gonna say in recent times, right? Annie Bell Satterwhite, mother of Bill Brown. Annie Bell Satterwhite, whose father, Bill Brown? Yeah, oh my gosh, Bill Brown. And mother, Carrie Clarm, the ancestor of León, I think. Traced through generations, layered in smoke and ocean waves and sand and stone. Time taunts us in the lower matrix, right? these clocks around this bicycle. We're reminded of the poem Nearly 5,000 earlier in the collection, where León tells us, my father tells a story of my great-grandmother's sister, how she could read your spirit in cigar smoke, right? And so here in this, we have generations, water, smoke, time, names, accomplishments, figures, and babies. And here I have some kind of detailing of its anatomical hearts. And here we have a scar under, and then around the bicycle, we have this like written etch, right? It's just so interesting because we're reading these documents, and what it forced me to do, you know, is to like get really close to the book like this, right? To figure out what is happening. And it's a beautiful kind of relationship that you can have with the text, right? So here for you, I put time and smoke and movement and memory and pressured hearts and love and mothers and children and make so and make way, right? The relationship of this mother, daughter, layered over water, smoke, a photo, a document, the names of a descendant, and a relation made visible over 100 years traversed in one collage, right? And then we have a series of figures, and we actually don't have to know, right? We don't get to, well, we can ask, but we don't have to know who each of these figures are and their relationship to the creator of the collage, right? At best, we can speculate. But I think one of the things that comes really clear through is the love, the kinship, the remembrance, right, as an aspect of this work. Okay, so I'm thinking here about the palimpsest, right, and the way that it is rendered visible in these images, and why this idea of the genre calls to me is because my current book project, The Survival of a People, in that book I am also scrutinizing ancestry, devoting what little archival documents remain of Black Puerto Rican life, encountering that with the intimate, familiar stories, photos, maps, oral histories, and memory. I look at the gradual whitening of Puerto Ricans on the census documents and the way that memories, geography, and photos pull the rug out from under the illusion of racial democracy. I then turn to photography and documentary projects, seeing how we can document ourselves and how we do document ourselves. Here, León does the same through mixed media poetics, a genre of reckoning, of documenting their own families, right? It is the intimate that I want to move towards now, and that is the body. This collection came to me at the exact right time. I had no idea. After an excruciating, otherworldly natural labor 5 months ago, I experienced an almost fatal afterbirth. A trauma I have yet to unpack, and I'm not going to do so right here on the mic. But this book has been a real gift. In Black God, Mother This Body, León takes us into the cavities of mothering and godmothering. And by extension, it took me into a place of deep reflection. The speaker reminds us that blood, milk, placenta, and bodies parting open. In short, birthing is no small thing for Black women whose bodies were once property, whose subject position as property was passed on to their offspring like a disease. Black women who withstood and withstand the death wish of the state. Black women who now in 2022 have a maternal mortality rate up to 3 times the rate of white women. This maternal body is not just a site of reproduction and pain, but also a locus of delight, feeling of fluttering life and ecstatic pain, sexual pleasure. And then a few, acupuncture points too as well, you know what I'm saying, necessary. We look on as León shows us what it's like to be seen, but not witnessed by one's godmother, right? How to be seen and not witnessed by one's own family. The sting of being la negrita in a family that would otherwise deny its anti-Blackness. The coming to terms with both the expansiveness and the limits of kinship. I want to first read this poem because I'm going to move on to 2 more and then I'm done, I promise. How body unhinges to birth. Serpent, stone coil, gilded in plume, vibrato or captured. An iconic reminder, river god hold. Headless, dust swirled, voice fount, like the dance exhale and flame. Lightning, quiver breath skin, roots descend within, a lake before rupture, no reckoning for start, breakthrough. Chartless waters shape-shifting. A fire is a ring to all beginnings, fish to mewling mouth. And see here, in the form, we get a sense of the stone coil, right? The kind of undulating waves of what it means to unhinge one's body for birth. And actually, you don't unhinge your own body. It does that on its own, right? But there's something quite incredible about sitting with this poem that demands that we think through, right? The light, the gilded plume, the exhale, the flame, the fire, right? And the newness of life that is possible. And as León thinks through mothering and thinks through the mothering body and the laboring body, she also moves towards thinking about what happens after, right? The reflection on one's children, the desire and the fears deeply embedded in that kind of love. And here are two poems. I'll start with The Only Color, which broke my heart in reading it the first time. Verde, 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 every color is verde. And I think on Federico Garcia Lorca, how I read this poem to him days old, his whole body less than 6 pounds on my chest, and how he stands on a wild octopus boy on a chair, reaching for the markers. Verde, verde, he says, though the uncapped tool marks page to orange, and his father says he knows what the best color is. I say naranja or anaranjado, he has to know his colors. And I go into a diatribe about school, not being behind. It is not about school. He is my son, and so the box waits. A check mark of abuse is woven into his identity. Will he ever be able to just be the creative child who says verde, verde, verde for all the colors, glorified for how his mind stretches divergent? My husband does not know what that box can be, does not know that the box can be a casket, and each day we must fight for it not to be. Ahmad ran on a street lined with green leaves. Lorca wrote a poem. They shot him too. So bright. I just want my son to know his colors and live. Fuck. As for son, for daughter. Our daughter is born 2 days after George Floyd called out to his dead mother, or he says he sees this as racism. To witness how different our care by doctors knows this is racism, and my proximity to whiteness may keep me and our child alive. My blood condemns us, and birthing continues. May my name in her mouth never be said in fear. Never mama, they kill me. Our ancestors again, and all the possibilities. Mama, I'm through. Pop. I circle back here to the start, to León's reflection on the political and the personal. It is relational. What happens in our streets finds us in our most intimate of moments. It finds us at home, in our seats, in our living rooms, in our bathrooms, in our tubs, everywhere. Poetry is not a luxury, and we need it to survive. And I don't have an ending here. And I can't end it because it's work I'm still engaging. But I can say that Raina's work came to me right on time. Thank you. And she has copies of her book. They sold out last night, but she has some more, $15. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? We have time. Questions for Judith, Marisel, Yomaira? Yes.
So this question is actually for all three, but it's picking up and maybe flipping something that Yomaira said, which is what the archive is collage. But I think in the work that all of you are doing is the collage archive. Or collage is a scholarly practice.
I don't know if I'm going to answer this the right way, but I will say that I was really taken by the images in the book, the collages. And I'll say I resonate so much with the work that was being shared today, particularly around the difficulty of becoming mothers and the kind of losses and the pain that are layered in there. And one of the things that in the kind of 7 years that it took for our baby to come into this world, I began to go back to my own arts practice. And one of the first things I started to do was to paint. And then I started to layer on top of that paint. And then I started to stitch. And then I started to add beading. And then I started to create lino, lino cuts. And then I started to sew those onto the canvases. And then I started to build up, right? I started to dye fabric and tear it and sew that into the canvases and just continue to do that kind of thing. So then when I began to have a different relationship to collaging, to mixed media, and also a different relationship to the archive, particularly because when on the other side of my life, going into the archives and both the racism that you face, like in IRL, like in real life, going there, and then also the kind of antiseptic nature of what you are seeing, right? You're seeing documents that try to tell you what things are at face value, even though you yourself know that those things are not true. And even though the stories that your family can tell you that those are not true. And sometimes, when you're really lucky, those things can then reflect back to you something that is true, that it confirms, right? But most of the time, it's absurdities. And so, for example, one of the absurdities that I reckon with and what I'm writing about now is the fact that, on my father's death certificate, it says that he's white. He's Puerto Rican, he's white, which is like LOL, like never in life, right? Like no one would ever see this man and say that. But then I realized that this is a common practice, both in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora, right? And so these are the kinds of things that if someone was going there without the context or cultural context that we have, you can say Puerto Rico does not have Black people, right? Like it's just systematically whitening folks, right, through documentation. But then if you actually have the other layered knowledge, right, the kind of context, the kinship, and all of that kind of thing, then and you can counter that with something else. But I think that collaging is the layering and the never taking of the archive as face value. And I think that we can do that in our arts practices, and that can reflect also back into our research practices. And then maybe those are not different practices at all, right? I don't know if that answers the question at all, but
Maybe I should just go ahead and answer the question. Anyway, thank you so much for both of your readings. They were amazing. I was, estaba llorando at the end. And I want to say that with regards to the archive and just thinking about City Without Alter, I was expecting when I opened the PDF, I was like, oh, okay, cool. I was wondering what I was gonna open, just because I'd been kind of like ruminating over the ways that Mendez created her own archive, right, through her own writing, that in many ways for me told the truths, right? For me, it was the truths that she provided through that, with regards to Dominicanidad, with regards to disability, and with regards to attempting to bear children within medical scientific, the medical industrial complex. And all of that together became the archive that I got to kind of spend time with. And also by way of putting, Mendez's work, because Mendez's work she's theorizing, right? So in many ways, I had to turn to Black feminists talking about, right, what reproduction means and what medical scientific discourses has been imposing onto Black women's bodies historically, right? And so I had to turn to Zakiya Jackson, and then all of a sudden, I found a whole other archive, right? Where all of a sudden Zakiya Jackson, Black feminist, right, does history of science, it's in full-blown conversation, right? Or is in some ways thinking about, right, this Caribbean Afro-Latinx experience of feminist and disability. And so, and I really, to me, that's that's where there was like a collaboration that existed there between these two theorists, I would say. I would call Mendez also a theorist on top of a poet, a playwright. And and of course for me, I came to it from a completely different positionality, as well as with my own experiences with childbearing, right? Or attempting to childbear. And so all of that there was this kind of assemblage that occurred for me where I'm just like, it's just an entirely new archive that is being created through poetics, that we can actually turn to poetics now. Yeah, we can go to the archive. But for me, the affect, the pain, the survival, the knowledge all exists within the aesthetic of poetry and prose, and performance. I'm a literary theorist, and I'm also, I came late to the game and I was a performer. So I'm still all for aesthetics. I wish that I could have heard y'all yesterday, the day before. And thank you so much. I think that's it. That's all I have to say. Disculpe.
So in terms of the archive, when I'm thinking, is it more in relation to the works that we're dealing with?
That, but also just practices as a scholar, like how you bring things together, or especially I think in terms of creating this conversation, right? A lot of it is in fact like almost like collaging together.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm just being absurd in saying that scholarship does collage because we bring all this stuff together, that we have to put together a new relation. But also just, anyhow, that's too much. Yeah.
I guess just the more simple answer, right? A lot of it has to do with the poets that we come across, to be honest. And in my case, being connected to or having the opportunity to get to know particular poets, it just creates, you start to see some of the silences, right, that we're aware of in terms of Latinx literature, and I have gravitated towards authors and poets who are Afro-Latinx to do what I can as a white Latina to lift the voices that usually don't get much visibility in academia and beyond, right? So it's happened that way. I mean, sometimes you can find really wonderful connections. Like I'm seeing some of these slides, right, of your new work, and I'm thinking right away of Alan Pelaez's work. Wow, I mean that's an article right there, right? But yeah, so just anyway, I'm gonna stop there.
Are we done, or do we have any more questions? Thank you.
Wait, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to say one thing, Marisel, because what you made me think about is a kind of a methodology that I think is super important, and I just wanted to underscore what you said, which is you start with the poetry. So rather starting with a sense of critique or a sense of making a theory bear on the work, sitting with the work and letting it guide you, becomes such an important methodology that I think is not only necessary for all poetics, but especially for Afro-Latinx poetics, because I think if you start in another place, then you will try to take that work in a place where it does not want to go, right? So that I think that method is really great, and thank you for saying that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. These three poets we've been hearing about are going to perform their work tonight. So come hear them. If you get there at 7:15, you'll be fed. And their books will be for sale. Thank you.